Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This video is a response to a Twitter thread by a Christian named Rob, aka Woody, in which he offered a response to my thread on Herem warfare being a form of human sacrifice. If you have not read the thread or watched my previous video, I recommend seeing those first before watching this video. Anyway, I thank Rob for his effort and offer my rebuttal here. Right from the get-go, let me correct Rob. I didn't say that the Israelites actually sacrificed people to God upon his actual orders. If it did happen in history, it was not at the command of God. I made it clear that, per the Jewish Study Bible, it seems that the stories of devoting humans to Yahweh were the product of a later time. The JSB states that the law of the ban is an anachronistic literary formulation. It first arose centuries after the settlement. It was never implemented because there was no population extant against whom it could be implemented. Its polemic in favor of religious purity is directed at internal issues in 6th century Judah. Next, Rob cautioned us regarding the definition of Herem. We have to be nimble in how we interpret this word. I agree, which is why I had suggested that he also watch my previous video on the subject. I don't think he did. In it, I cited Bergsma and Petrie in A Catholic Introduction to the Bible, who defined Herem in a military context. As we can see, they defined Herem in a military context as the dedication of a city as a sacrifice or offering to God. They even compare it to a burnt offering, per Joshua 6:17 through 19. We will come back to the status of Herem as a burnt offering near the end of the video. So yes, it is precisely when we are nimble and pay attention to context that the nature of Herem as a sacrifice in a military context becomes clear. This is also the meaning given by Moshe Benovitz in his book Kol Nidre, Studies in the Development of Rabbinic Votive Institutions. He explains that the total destruction is an offering to God. Rob then dealt with the individual verses I had cited in my original thread, beginning with Leviticus 27:28 through 29. He cited numerous commentaries from the ESV, the NIV, etc., but none of these discussed the sacrificial element of Herem. It seems to me that these Christian commentaries are trying more to explain the reason for the Herem, i.e. to get rid of a pagan quote-unquote contagion, rather than explain what Herem actually is. Here I will provide additional commentary from Moshe Benovitz. First, it is important to note the editorial gloss in Leviticus 27:28 through 29. No human being who is made Herem can be ransomed. He shall be put to death. Benovitz argues that verse 28a, from the word but to the word redeemed, is a later addition, and gives his reasons. He states, as it stands, Leviticus 27:28 consists of two sentences, each of which begins with the same Hebrew words, and both of which state the same idea, that the sanctity of the Herem is absolute and irrevocable. The two half verses are doublets, and it would seem that the more explicit of the two, 28a, was added in order to interpret the less explicit 28b. He also clearly identifies the Herem in verse 29 as implying a slave being immolated as an offering to God. This is nothing other than human sacrifice. Notice also that Benovitz critiques the rabbis for ignoring the immediate context of the previous verse. In other words, he's talking about guys like Rashi, whom Rob also cited. Benovitz also notes the contradiction that arises between Leviticus 27:21, which states that a field can be taken by the priest and be in full possession of it, and Leviticus 27:28b. Benovitz notes that verse 28b clearly restates the contagious nature of the pre-Deuteronomic and Deuteronomic Herem in priestly terms. However, according to Leviticus 27:21, Herem land is the personal possession of the priest. One can hardly imagine a contagious field counted among the personal possessions of a priest, yet off limits to his wife and daughters, and to all farmhands who are not ritually pure priests. Moreover, the produce of the field would presumably also be Herem and therefore not marketable. So there is firm evidence that Herem was meant to be an offering to God. When humans are involved in an offering and are killed as a result, that obviously would be equivalent to human sacrifice. It is important to note that offering a human sacrifice has precedence in the Bible. The best example is Judges 11, where the Israelite warrior Jephthah makes a vow to Yahweh to sacrifice whatever comes through his door to meet him after defeating the Ammonites. This vow was made while the Spirit of the Lord was on him. Verse 29. Unfortunately, it turns out that his daughter is the first to greet him, so he ends up sacrificing her. Note that Jephthah was under divine inspiration at the time he made the vow. The Spirit of God was on him. And, moreover, never does God indicate that this burnt offering is reprehensible and that he will not accept it. He is conspicuously silent. As Benevitz notes, there's absolutely no condemnation of this act. It is also interesting to see how the ESV Study Bible, which Rob cited in his response, attempts to exonerate Yahweh from any involvement in this tragedy. First, in his commentary on Judges 14, verse 6, it mentions how God's Spirit can act on people and lists Jephthah as an example. At the same time, it refers to Jephthah's vow as foolish and misguided. It seems to conveniently forget that the Spirit of the Lord was on Jephthah, so how could his vow be foolish? Furthermore, why didn't God simply intervene and stop the sacrifice in the first place? Coming back to the practice of Herem, Rob claims that no academic source he looked at, by which he meant conservative Christian and Jewish commentaries, equates Herem with human sacrifice. Well, he didn't really check well enough. I cited Bergsma and Petrie, who were Catholics, and Moshe Benevitz is a professor of Talmud and rabbinics. These academic sources categorically refer to Herem as being akin to human sacrifice. Another academic source is Tom Stark, a Christian. I cited him in my previous video. Stark compared the language of the Mesha Stele to Numbers 21. Here I have juxtaposed the text of the Mesha Stele as provided by Bergsma and Petrie with Stark's explanation on Numbers 21. Stark clearly equates the Herem with human sacrifice. This was also the view of Suzanne Niditch, whose book, War in the Hebrew Bible, was cited by Stark. Rob then cited Professor Mike Wegman's article on Herem in the journal Verbum, who explains that Herem was about obeying Yahweh. So let us discuss this. First, Wegman accepts the general view of scholars that the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua were written between the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, and were certainly not written by Moses or Joshua. Wegman also states that the famous Battle of Jericho in the book of Joshua is not even a historical account, since the Israelite conquest occurred around 1400 BCE. This date is disputed, while Jericho was destroyed around 1550 BCE. This would then make the whole chapter one long pseudo-historical account. Regardless, Wegman's analysis of Herem being about obeying Yahweh is all well and good. But, like the other commentaries Rob cited, Wegman only seems to discuss the purpose of Herem, obeying God, not its implication. Like most traditional Christian and Jewish scholars, he fundamentally ignores the implication of the Herem. But he does show that, at least in Joshua 6, Herem is variously defined as devoted, prescribed, and as a solemn ban. In other words, the people of Jericho were devoted or prescribed to Yahweh for destruction, and the city could not be settled, hence the ban. Just because Wegman doesn't call this human sacrifice, that is what it is by its nature. Incidentally, Wegman also refers to the Herem as a necessary evil. Rob also cited a blog post by a quote-unquote seminarian who claimed that Herem was a way to end pagan practices, and an act of worship by obediently destroying paganism. This is a strange comment. How does resorting to Herem, which other pagan ancient Near Eastern cultures also practiced, somehow destroy paganism? Citing the Mesha Stele, Bergsma and Petrie explained that this was a common practice among the pagan cultures. Furthermore, even if destroying paganism was the reason for the Herem, that does not explain what it entails, i.e., human sacrifice. You can sacrifice pagans to end paganism, but at the end of the day, it is still a form of human sacrifice. Also, if the reason for the Herem was to simply destroy paganism, then why was it necessary to kill children and infants and animals as well? Was the so-called contagion, as scholars call it, a literal virus? Like COVID, that infected the children and animals too? Obviously, this makes no sense. How could infants and animals somehow, quote, entice the Israelites to worship these false gods? Next, Rob commented on the JSP commentary on Leviticus 27:28-29. He claimed that the commentary didn't endorse the ceremonial killing of humans to Yahweh. This is also a strange comment. The JSB calls the Herem an offering to God. When a human is offered to a deity and is put to death, what is that other than human sacrifice? The next comment by Rob is also very strange. He stated that the JSB analyses would be, quote, cleared up if the authors had read Rashi, as if the JSB commentators were somehow unaware of Rashi's commentary. They were not, since they're cited throughout the book. But perhaps Rob missed the comment by the JSB about how the commentators, like Rashi's, interpretations of Leviticus 27:29 have little basis. Rob then said that the JSB commentary on Joshua 6 is a, quote, general statement about war ideologies, and that I was appealing to eisegesis in my analysis of the JSB commentary. First, I agree with Rob. It is about war ideologies, but I disagree that the JSB doesn't equate it with human sacrifice. As we just saw, it did. Rob seems to ignore what these war ideologies, as in the Mesha stele, imply. Offering a city as a sacrifice to a deity in exchange for victory. Under normal circumstances, the victors would take the surviving people, animals, and treasure as spoils. But when making a pact with a patron deity, those spoils are forfeited, as they now belong to the deity. As such, they are to be destroyed. They are literally sacrificed. This is not eisegesis, it is common sense. Moshe Benowitz also explains further that Herem means a communal dedication to God. He states that a Herem is a dedication to God. It differs from a nader in that a nader is a personal vow of dedication made from private property, while a Herem is communal property set aside for God. These can be either spoils of war or people and property condemned by the authorities, sometimes metaphorically said to be sacrificed by God himself. Human beings or livestock devoted to God under these circumstances are slaughtered as an offering, albeit usually without the trappings of an altar and temple. So you don't need a literal altar or a temple for something to be considered a human sacrifice. The only difference with Herem is that there is no altar or temple in which the sacrifice is offered. Incidentally, Benowitz also points to Isaiah 34, 1-8, as another example of Herem being akin to sacrifice. He says, even when God himself is the agent of destruction, the sacral character remains central to the notion of Herem. God slaughters the victim of the Herem as a meal for himself. In fact, the clearest expression of the Herem of destruction as a sacrificial divine meal is Isaiah 34, 1-8. Indeed, in Isaiah 34, verse 2, God devotes the nations to destruction, Herem. But in verse 6, it is God's sword, which is already sated with the blood and fat of sacrificial animals, that is to be used for a different type of purpose, since God now has a sacrifice in Basra. Basra was the capital of Edom, which in turn symbolized all the Gentile nations. Thus, Isaiah 34 very clearly equates Herem with sacrificial killing. Interestingly, on Isaiah 34, the ESV Study Bible equates the world with a bloody altar, as God requires payment for sin, though the commentary anachronistically adds that the only refuge for anyone is the sacrifice of Christ. Regardless of this Christian anachronism, what is admitted by the ESV Study Bible is that the threat of destruction is equated with a sacrifice. The bloody sword was previously used on sacrificial animals. Now it is pointed at the nations. They are to become the sacrifice. Rob also attempted to sideline the JSP commentary as just one opinion and not the ultimate authority. But as I have shown, other sources say the same thing. For example, Bergsma and Petrie, Benowitz, Stark, and Nidich. Furthermore, for someone selectively quoting only conservative Christian and Jewish sources, Rob's criticism of the JSP is ironic. His conclusion is also very peculiar. He claims that it's not a contradiction that the Israelites were ordered to kill pagans and their children and animals, since it was not in a, quote, cultic fashion. I don't see what the difference is. It seems like he is saying that just because there was no altar or tabernacle for the sacrifice, therefore it was not a sacrifice. This is a non sequitur. As previously cited, Benowitz explains that the Herem is still a sacrifice, even if an altar or temple are not present. I also wonder if Rob thinks that the Moabites were simply killing their Israelite enemies and did not see them as, quote, sacrifices to their god Chemosh, simply because there was no altar used. Rob also suggested that I look at more than just one commentary. Again, if he had watched the previous video, as I had suggested weeks ago, he would know not to make such a comment. He also, again, tried to redefine what human sacrifice should mean. Apparently, since the killing of pagans was, quote, judgmental, it doesn't make it a sacrificial killing. But who said that a, quote, judgmental killing cannot be a sacrificial one as well? Isaiah 34 shows that they can be one and the same thing. God judges the nations and is about to make a sacrifice of them. That the Herem killings clearly were sacrificial can also be seen in the Amalekite genocide. That is why Saul was reprimanded for keeping the best animals of the Amalekites and sparing King Agag. They were supposed to be destroyed because they belonged to Yahweh, but Saul and his men couldn't part with the valuable spoils. Before I close, I want to draw your attention to one more piece of evidence, straight from the Bible, where Yahweh himself again refers to Herem as a sacrifice. It is even clearer than Isaiah 34. Deuteronomy 13, verses 12 through 18 provide Yahweh's command in the case of an Israelite city that engages in idolatry or tolerates it among some of its residents. The command is to destroy the whole city, along with all the spoils, i.e. the people, cattle, and treasures. Note that verse 16 states that all these spoils are to be placed in the city square and burned as a whole burnt offering to God. The city is the burnt offering. In other words, it is a sacrifice of humans, animals, and objects to God. The BDB lexicon clearly defines the Hebrew word used in Deuteronomy 13 as a sacrificial term, a sacrifice that is to be consumed wholly on the altar. Now, in this case, there was no altar. The city was the altar. Notice that it says in Deuteronomy 13:17, "And thou shalt burn the city and all its spoil as a whole offering." In conclusion, we have strong evidence from the Bible that Herem was understood as a form of human sacrifice. And Yahweh, like the pagan god Chemosh, is made into a deity that demanded such offerings. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وقل جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا